Welcome to The Author Show, where we present new authors and books. From fiction to self-help and everything in between, you'll find it all here. To watch the TV version of our program, visit authorswebtv.com. That's authorswebtv.com. And now, let the show begin with your hosts, Don McCauley and Danielle Hampson.
Hello and welcome back to the show. This is your host, Don McCauley. Today we're welcoming the program author Patrick Brigham, and Patrick is the author of Judas Goat, the Kennet Narrow Boat Mystery. Patrick has been a writer and journalist for many years. He's published many short stories, newspaper, and magazine articles. Born in the English home counties, he attended public school and college before moving to London and embarking on his career. Having spent the last 20 years in Eastern Europe, many of his stories are set in this part of the world, as well as Oxford, Hampshire, and Berkshire. As the editor-in-chief of the first English-language news magazine in Sofia, Bulgaria between 1995 and 2000, and as a journalist, he witnessed the changes this once hardcore communist country and personally knew most of the political players. Patrick, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Don.
Let's start with a big question. Tell us about this book, please.
Well, I suppose like most writers, I write with a very special reader in mind. I know that most young people have been programmed by TV and action movies and therefore do not really have the patience to allow a methodological detective to unravel a crime. With Judas Goat, the Kennet Narrow Boat Mystery, I see my readers as being more thoughtful and imaginative without any gender bias at all. And this is because, in essence, this book is not particularly violent and our detective rarely becomes angry. He must be probably better described as thinking with his head and not his mouth.
Who did you write this book for specifically?
I wrote this book for people more or less over the age of 30. I don't actually think that very young people really quite understand this genre because they're convinced there are far too many distractions on TV. But this is for people who rather enjoy that Morse type story, or perhaps something a little bit more refined than your average detective story and the violence which it also has.
Now, would you say that there's any type of central message or perhaps underlying theme that runs throughout the book?
The central message in the book is not the usual story about a murder, because murders happen quite a lot, really. The central message is who the person is and why he's been killed. It all starts off rather quietly in a backwater in England, but of course, finally, it ends up as being an international manhunt, or a part of it. And I think that that's what makes this book interesting, because it goes from being from the mundane into the international, into political, and finally into arms dealing and money laundering.
It's called the Narrow Boat Mystery. What's the significance of a narrow boat? What is that?
Well, first of all, a canal is a very quiet and tranquil place. Then they are no longer used for commercial reasons, and it's where holidaymakers spend their weekends and holidays. And so this guy, he's sitting on a narrowboat, but unfortunately he's dead. He doesn't look like it though. He's sitting in a Lloyd loom chair, I don't know whether you know what those are, and he's sort of staring into oblivion. And he's discovered by a local fisherman because blaring away in the background is Art Tatum playing Begin the Beguine, and our friend the fisherman is getting fed up with listening to it. And he says, well, haven't you got any other music you can play? And of course there's no reply.
If you could compare this book with any book out there we might already be familiar with, which book would it be and why?
Well, it's not so much a book, it's more a question of the writers. I'm really from the Cold War period. I was born just after the Second World War. And of course, I've always enjoyed John le Carrier, and I've always enjoyed Graham Greene, for example. I also like Ludlum, and I like people like Colin Dexter, who wrote books about Morse. I think Morse has been fairly familiar in America. So I quite like that English detective story, but I rather like it to be a bit more interesting and involved. I think we've seen quite enough detectives sitting in bars chatting to their sergeant about who did what, where and how, and then going and shouting at somebody. it's probably a little bit more interesting to discover that behind some of these crimes there are old communists and rather disreputable people, maybe who've worked for the security services.
What motivated you to write this book in the first place?
Well, there are lots of corny answers to that particular question, one of which is it probably wrote itself. But if it did so over quite some time, because I first started writing it in around about 2001. The very beginning, of course, was a nostalgic look at England, something which I hadn't seen for some 10 years at that point. And then, of course, there was a gap. Don't we all have to do it? We have to earn some money and to pay the bills. And then it was about 8 years later that I decided to finish it, which I did remarkably in 3 months. I wanted to write a book which had a little bit more to it. Having lived in Eastern Europe, I know how these people think, and I knew how their attitude, their morality, if you like, is a little bit obscure to some people. Explained to me once that being in an ex-communist country was rather like looking in a cracked mirror. Everything was back to front and slightly distorted.
What part of this story would you say you're most proud of?
I think I'm proud of the fact that it doesn't bother me too much about talking about arms dealing, because when you pick up your newspaper or look at your CNN, it's all about people shooting each other. And guess what? Guess how they do that? Well, they have guns, and guess where they come from? Don't ask. And I think that's the bit I'm quite proud of, that I'm not frightened to discuss it, or even to suggest how a lot of it is done and by whom it is done, because a lot of these people are very respectable. They're big corporations, and of course there's an awful lot of money involved. Do they pay their taxes? Good question. But Switzerland's a very convenient country for some people to visit.
What book genre do you like?
Well, I like a lot of things. You know, I'm a little bit of a general reader. When I was young, I used to read anything from Samuel Pepys to Dennis Wheatley. I loved Laurie Lee, for example, because he was a very descriptive writer. I like John le Carrier because his dialogue is so good. I think I like books that reflect a certain time, a certain period. Maybe we're talking about the late 80s and early 90s, when things really did begin to change. After the famous collapse of the Berlin Wall, I imagine that a lot of people's minds were changed and their lives were changed as well. I think that's the period I'm more interested in.
How do you develop a story?
I think you need to have a storyline, but very often writers who write by numbers, I'm sure that they're very successful in their way, but I don't seem to be able to do that. I have a general idea. I even have a sort of a beginning and an end sometimes. But what I find is that the pen is rather inclined to do the writing sometimes, and these characters start popping into your head. Remember, you're in a sort of semi-conscious state when you're writing. Occasionally your memory reappears where perhaps it wasn't there some time before, and this is really where some of these characters come from, and some of the storylines as well.
Where do you get your inspiration?
Well, you get up in the morning and you look around. There are people everywhere. I find inspiration very often comes from having a good memory. I don't know, it's rather a mixed blessing actually having a good memory, because unfortunately you tend to remember the good and the bad. But my inspiration comes from the past in some respects, and then I pick up a newspaper or I look at a TV set or whatever, and suddenly I'm awake and alive to the present time, and I think, well, you know, perhaps there's a story there, or perhaps there's a story which I can tell, which if I tell it properly might make people think.
Would you say that you have a specific writing style?
Yes, I think I do actually. It floats between dialogue and description. I don't seem to always fit it in together. I find that when you're using descriptive writing, it's about people doing things. They're going somewhere, they're arriving, they're coming to conclusions, they're making things happen. When we're involved with dialogue, I find that that's about coming to the end of one of these activities. But in the case of a policeman, of course, he's cross-examining somebody. But we need dialogue to express our feelings and emotions. Without dialogue, nobody would ever know whether we loved or hated them.
Who or what influenced your writing the most?
I think I was influenced mainly by the Le Carriers and those English writers. But you see, I like Robert Ludlum too, and I think he's a very, very good writer. In the past, I read just about everything that I could do. I'm looking at a bookshelf now. I've got Salinger there. I've got all sorts of American writers who in the past have meant a lot to me. Saul Bellof was always a great writer as far as I was concerned. So it's a mixture. It's a melange. It's a kind of potpourri of writers from different backgrounds, different times in history.
Who, in your opinion, should buy this book?
I think most people who read this kind of book have got a little bit more patience than others. I see the readers of this book, the people who can associate themselves with it. I mean, I always remember the words of C.S. Lewis, which is that we read to know that we're not alone. There are people over the age of 30, shall we say, who are a little bit more patient, a little bit more imaginative, who have time to consider literature a little bit more carefully and not seeing it in terms of being a consumer. You do get consumers of literature, like you get consumers of hamburgers, but there are those who actually treasure a book and treasure a story. I think those are the people that I'm writing for.
Time's getting very short, so the most important question, where can we buy this book?
You can buy your copy of this book at Amazon, both in the US and UK, Barnes & Noble, and AB Book. But you can also buy it on my website, which is www.patrickbrigham.co.uk.
Could you spell your name for us, please?
Patrick, Patrick, and Brigham, Brigham, the same as your famous Brigham Young.
Well, it's been just great. Our guest today has been Patrick Brigham, and he is the author of Judas Goat, the Kennet Narrow Boat Mystery. Patrick, thanks very much for being with us today.
My pleasure, Don. Thank you very much.
This is Don McCauley wrapping up another edition of the Author Show. If you're an author or know an author, learn how you can help a publisher publish you by visiting helpapublisherpublishyou.com. Each month you receive a listing of publishers, small presses, and others who may be interested in publishing your work. This is a free service of the Author Show. If you'd like to be a guest in the show, visit www.theauthorshow.com, fill out the form, and we may be contacting you shortly. And if you're an author, don't forget to visit Book Marketing, the Author's Marketing Powerhouse, at www.theauthorsmarketingpowerhouse.com. We look forward to seeing you here next time on the Author Show.
Thanks for listening to The Author Show. To contact us, call toll-free 1-877-955-8800. That's 877-955-8800. Or visit theauthorshow.com. That's theauthorshow.com. Tune in next time to another great author on The Author Show.